Want to annoy China? Propose an Asian NATO. Japanese Prime Minister presses for collective defense. Using a metaphorical bullhorn, Japan's new Prime Minister, Shigeru Ishiba, and who is also the former defense minister, has demonstrated that he is the most hawkish prime minister in Japan since the end of World War II. Playing into China's fears, Prime Minister Ishiba has pushed for an idea of an Asian NATO as a serious attempt at collective defense. The proposal has received fierce opposition from China and demonstrates how the two Asian economic powerhouses differ in their approach to relations with their neighbors in the Western Pacific. The Chinese Communist Party has insisted that only bilateral discussions should address any disputes and other negotiations involving China, and that no other foreign powers, including and especially the United States, should ever participate in negotiations with China over regional issues. China has the largest economy in the region, and it has the largest military. China prefers bilateral negotiations due to its economic and military position, which it can use to leverage against any country that chooses to negotiate with it. China can use these advantages to intimidate another country, thereby steering negotiations towards its preferred outcome. Bilateral negotiations give China all the advantage against non-peer rivals. Most countries in the region understand the disadvantages of negotiations with China and will usually choose to forego negotiations to avoid raising the ire of China. China, knowing that most regional countries will not directly challenge it, becomes emboldened to act more aggressively and to bully them. When the countries hesitate to engage in negotiations with China due to fear of retaliation, forming alliances enhances their chance against them, thereby reducing their intimidation tactics, meaning China. China continues to insist on bilateral negotiations, but the formation of alliances shields a non-negotiating country from isolation or potential aggression. Japan has pursued agreements with the U.S., the Philippines, South Korea, AUKUS, and NATO, just to name a few. The Japanese government is taking a different approach by forming alliances with other regional countries and the United States instead of relying on direct bilateral talks with China. Multilateral alliances aim to counterbalance or challenge China's dominant position in the region, just as bilateral agreements benefit China. This approach aligns with Japanese foreign policy from the 1950s, which has undergone slight modifications in response to security changes, including the end of the Cold War and the rise of China. Even though the security situation has changed, the Japanese foreign policy approach remains the same based on two factors: internationalism and the U.S.-Japanese alliance. Japan cannot move too far from this position, as its constitution, which was drafted while Japan was under U.S. post-war occupation, forbids the sending of its armed forces overseas. This limited the effect of Japanese foreign policy and had a limiting factor on how Japan, as an economic power, assumed it had a role in maintaining a stable world order, as it was a nation relying on foreign trade to maintain its influence in the world. It did not have the ability to deploy forces overseas. It relies on internationalism such as the UN or what promotes the U.S.-Japanese alliance. Prime Minister Ishiba utilizes the Japanese philosophy of armed forces to express his desire to form loose alliances and to establish collective security in the region, similar to NATO and its Article 5 guarantees. Japan maintains formal ties with NATO, but this proposal is not to extend NATO into Asia, but to create an Asian version of it. The region's loose alliances and security agreements, typically bilateral or with limited partners, are a patchwork lacking specific measures to respond to a nation's attack. As an Asian NATO would formalize an alliance that truly enacts collective security as outlined in NATO Article 5, which is an attack on one is an attack on all. This would serve as a deterrent to China, as it would lose its ability to threaten a military response to a member state in the event of a regional war against it. If China attempts to use the veiled threat of military force in the region, it will effectively negate its major advantages to member countries. Despite the potential benefits of an Asian NATO and China's concerns, not all countries share the same perspective on the threat posed by China. When they created NATO, the members clearly viewed the USSR as the overwhelming threat to the West. However, that is not the case in Asia, and many Asian countries are part of the global South and would see an Asian NATO as an attempt to extend the West's influence over developing nations. ASEAN, a bloc of countries in the region, pursues a policy of non-alignment, which would be contrary to the position of the 10 countries that make up the bloc. China has employed a combination of incentives and sanctions to encourage countries to maintain strong ties with it, which they would believe would not be possible if they joined an alliance. Another issue stems from the aftermath of World War II, where many still hold unfavorable views of the Japanese due to their actions during the war and their perceived lack of remorse. For instance, South Korea is only beginning to open up to an agreement with Japan, making it unlikely that a Japan-led Asian alliance would garner significant support within the region. Japan's economy in Asia is second only to China, and it is considering increasing its defense spending to 2% of GDP, which would give it the third largest defense budget in the world behind the US and China. Japan, with its economic and defense expenditure, would naturally be the leader of the creation of an Asian NATO from an internationalist perspective. It will have to base the alliance on the US-Japan security partnership and accept the US as the leader in the alliance. This would tend to make more sense, as Japan would not want to appear to be creating a system that rivals US power in the region. A U.S. involvement would resolve the leadership issue and make it more acceptable to nations wary of Japan's role. The drawback is that the U.S. leading the alliance would not address the suspicions of the global South. The problem for Japan is that the U.S. has responded that it is not interested in a NATO-like alliance in Asia and appears to be committed to the current patchwork of alliances in the Western Pacific. Without U.S. support, suspicion from the global South Asian nations, and apprehension of Japanese leadership, Prime Minister Ishiba's desire for collective defense in Asia is likely to fail, which is a relief to China. Not that his idea is bad, it would solve many of China's aggressive policies and the creation of security issues in the region, but it's not the time for it. And most countries in the region having varying relationships with China, there's no unanimous security threat to bind the nations in the region together. So any alliance would likely fail like SEATO did in 1977.